DAOs, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, this infinite design space of new forms of collaboration. So many opportunities to rewrite how we organize work, social circles, resource allocation, and more. And so many opportunities to overcomplicate things, design terrible systems with crappy incentive and worse governance models. The example being the ubiquitous token voting. I am personally still super excited about DAOs. The book on organizational theory, Reinventing Organizations, shows examples of very successful companies outside of Web3 that share ownership, responsibility, and accountability among all employees, creating more empowering and egalitarian systems. DAOs seem to be the perfect fit to overcome some of the challenges that these organizations face, but are DAOs ready to make it into the mainstream? Ownco aims to do just that, slowly introduce the best of Web3, tokenization of value and ownership, without the complicated UX and dubious regulatory situation of Web3. The idea is to be a Trojan horse to introduce DAO practices in Web2 companies until they are ready to own themselves. Sasha and Moe from Ownco are experts in the fields of DAOs, and so is dOrg, the first DAO ever registered as an LLC. If you want more content from experts like these, hit subscribe, follow, or like right now. Owning the microphone, Sasha and Moe from Ownco.
Hey everyone, thank you for the warm welcome. So my name is Sasha, I'm here with Moe, both from Ownco. We're a small startup originally based out of Berlin, but we're a fully remote company. We are working on promoting co-ownership, user ownership, and we've built a solution that enables any company to share ownership with anyone based on their contributions. My background is in systems theory and systems thinking, which is a complexity science, and I specialized in organizational cybernetics, which is biomimicry. So I've spent a lot of my time thinking about how do you design organizations that use the network as a metaphor, and how do you copy patterns from nature and apply those to org design. In the DAO space, it's typically referred to as interactions between the HQ DAO and sub DAOs. I've sort of run systems design at Ownco. And Moe here can say a few words about himself.
Oh, hey guys. So I'm Moe. My background is in computer engineering. I was doing research in robotics, but was interested in the whole blockchain at around 2017. I joined the company. Then we were doing a marketplace that was connecting different sites, investors to companies that wanted to do investments. And 4 years after I joined Recursive, here we are.
Cool. So what we want to do with Ownco is essentially help companies share ownership. And why do we want to do that? Because we think shared ownership is the key to reducing wealth and influence inequality. And we believe that ownership should basically be distributed based on contribution to value. And governance should be distributed based on contribution to value. That's obviously tricky unless you have an improved definition of value and a better way of measuring and accounting for it. But we're also working on that. And, what is ownership? There's obviously a philosophical sort of question, but we define it as having control of the resources and the rules of a system. And, you'll see when we talk about the tech stack in a minute, we're short-term pragmatists and long-term maximalists. We believe in the long-term promise of DLT, but we also notice the reality of where most people are today and where traditional organizations and users are today. And that in a lot of cases is, they have the intent to share ownership and they want to build more equitable companies, but they are struggling to share ownership. So the most companies that we talk to are traditional Web2 companies, platforms, marketplaces, co-ops. So they vary in terms of their motivation and expertise around shared ownership. What they typically have in common is they struggle to share ownership in the sense that they don't know where to start, they don't know what to share, how much of it. They then look to either alternative ownership models that are sort of deeply embedded in the existing traditional legal system, like purpose or co-ops, and find those to be too rigid, or they go to DAOs and DAO tools or tokens, more broadly speaking, and find those to be too complex. So what we've done is we've basically, over the last year and a half, built or had lots of conversations with hundreds of companies and many, many more users around shared ownership. And what we learned is there's 3 big issues that they have. there's a big skill gap. Even like serial CEOs struggle with sharing ownership and designing cap tables, which I guess is the equity equivalent of a token economy. And that means that's a struggle. Then integrating tokens and with your existing legal entity makes it even harder. There's a huge cost in terms of the time and the money you would need to build it yourself. They then look to crypto and Web3, and what they see there is, it's a bit of a legal gray area, or at least not a tried and tested approach. Some of the things that raise concerns is the enforceability of decisions, the compliance of tokens, unless they are real world asset tokens that are bridged. And yeah, so the big three issues are typically around that. And what we've done is we've built Ownco. And Ownco is a pragmatic solution that basically lets companies tokenize real world assets, and then you can distribute them using what we call reputation tokens that you can earn by completing actions that help the platform or marketplace. So it's a solution that, is an infrastructure play. So we make it really easy for you to set up your own co, which is your own company. And as part of that setup step, you create a simple action and reward token incentive, which just means if you complete this action, you get X number of tokens, and you can then create in the next step a treasury where you can tokenize real world assets off chain, use our standardized legal bridges, and fill up the treasury with actual assets, so income streams from your legal entity, your marketplace, your platform, your core, and then you can distribute those valuable tokens because they're bridged with your token holders, right, that have already contributed to your business. So that, in a quick run through, is the solution. We've developed this over a year and a half. Mo is going to talk about the tech stack in more detail in a second. And yeah, it's in use with co-ops, marketplaces, and platforms that are looking to share ownership in an easy and pragmatic way. They get a full stack solution, which means you can onboard customers and users. You can create token incentives. You can bridge assets from your real world legal entity, and you can create a community page to market the token and to drive token adoption, where users can sign up themselves and support the business. And yeah, it's really easy to set up. We try to standardize everything and templatize. We're not tokenizing. We're templatizing reward and incentive models. So imagine, over all the projects we've done in the last couple of months, what we've seen is just an easy sort of repeatable patterns. Like there's signups, you want to incentivize top contributors, traditional ownership sharing with employees. Our system works by tokenizing RSUs and VSOPs, which means it counts as compensation, so it doesn't need to be registered as a security, and that makes it legally compliant. We have customers in several jurisdictions, US, Europe, and even Asia. It's pretty easy to run. Once you've created your token incentives, you can easily manage those and co-owners. And because of the way we've set up the tech stack, everything gives customers peace of mind. You can have this giant undo button, so some of the actions are reversible. And yeah, Mo, if you want, I pasted this in here. I hope I didn't surprise you with it, but feel free to talk about the tech stack.
I mean, so the main point maybe that I would talk about is how are we making this easy for the users, right? Because they could log in with an email and password, and that's one part I would talk about a little bit. And the idea is that we have a private chain, which is a proof of authority Geth node. So it runs everything similar to, let's say, Ethereum. And the reason behind that is that we want to stay close as much as possible while not conducting transactions on the mainnet or L2s. So it allows companies almost a way to have a sandbox to test things out, and allows them to slowly go through the process or the journey of decentralization. So we won't force a project or a company basically to fulfill some specific property, but it's on them to follow what level of decentralization they want to do. And so some companies would want to stay close until they figure more things out, and others would go further and further through the journey. And once that happens, then we will have a process of helping them migrate towards a mainnet, basically, and being, let's say, at the end almost of the journey of decentralization. So this is one point I would give and maybe there's like QAs.
Right on. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. Perfect in timing, I have to say. Congratulations on that. And yeah, now it's time to put you on the hot seat. Okay, so talked about reputation tokens and different sort of token strategies and how you can share ownership based on a series of incentives. And as a systems engineer, I'm sure you're familiar to the Cobra effect or perverse incentives effect, but I'm going to repeat it here just in case some people in the call are hearing of it for the first time. So the Cobra effect is when refers to the fact that when you give incentives for a certain thing, people are going to optimize for doing this certain thing. And it's called the Cobra effect because in New Delhi, in India, under the British rule, they had too many cobras that were killing people with their poison. And they said, for each cobra that you bring me, I'm going to pay you. And people at the beginning, it was very successful. People started killing cobras and bringing them to the authorities. But then other people started breeding cobras in order to be able to have some income. And when the authorities knew that this was happening, they stopped giving the incentive, and the people that were breeding cobras let them all loose. And the end result was that there was more cobras out there after this measure than before this measure. So this, in your case, it's kind of like very dangerous, because if what you're giving is part of the ownership of the company, you're giving away, you can't just take this back, you're giving away the ownership of the company. How do you tackle this?
I love the perverse incentive of the breeding cobras. We're at a stage as a young company where I'd say I'll take the cobras that are being bred. But to answer to your point more seriously, what we try and avoid is in the conversations with customers that we onboard is we try and avoid them thinking tokens or sharing ownership is a means to an end to find a business model or to fix something, because it's not. So we try to dissuade them from creating incentives that might mask product market fit or actual valuable contributions, right? So yeah, that's a super valid point, and I don't know if anyone's found an answer for it. What we try to do is we try to make it clear that you need to be careful what you get what you incentivize.
I guess
far we have outgrowths that are super bad for their customers.
I guess like this is what I meant is like the fact that we have like sort of templates, right? Like you mentioned that you had like already built models. How, like, have you found a case where there needs to be more customization than what the template is?
So most customers start with us with grand ideas of sharing ownership, and that is twofold. Like, one is they want to share a lot of ownership until they realize the implications. And the other is they have all these different incentives they want to set up. And then we try to just bring it back to our standardized framework of how do you start sharing ownership. And there's 3 steps that we tell them. So that's the larger framework. The first one is build conviction and momentum across your existing user base to share ownership, which you do with one simple incentive, action reward pair, and that's typically referrals. So that's where it starts. And this template then fits in into this larger 3-step framework towards progressively decentralizing. And the first step being a simple incentive, the second step being maybe an additional incentive. So on top, if it's a marketplace or platform, you're now incentivizing not just the supply side, but also the demand side. And now you have 2 incentives that are live, and people are getting more comfortable with sharing ownership using tokens. And you've done it in steps. So you've only tokenized, let's say, 1% of your cap table in the first step. In the second step, you now have your more active co-owner community, and you can involve them in the incentive design. So it's not like top-down centralized, but instead you start sharing ownership, designing ownership, co-ownership incentives collectively. And then the last step, which we haven't reached with any company yet, is intended to be just a continuation of that second step, more co-design and more co-ownership.
Wow, thank you. That was great. That was a great explanation. Thank you.
So the first question I had is, how does the treasury work if the organization is using your private POA chain?
Because it's a private chain, right? The company at that stage is not thinking from the context of a decentralized organization. So there is no treasury in the sense that you you have, let's say, a DAO and you have a treasury that you are controlling more, then it's a reference to that. The company has still full control of this. They still have full, they could conduct any transaction they would want to do for the treasury. So there is no like governance in that case. But as the company progresses and as they go, let's say, to mainnet, the moment that is the case, then of course it will be a relationship with the smart contracts, and it depends on their governance structure of how they want to conduct the treasury and how they want to utilize it.
Okay, got it. And then when they migrate to mainnet, is it possible to migrate, all those shares of ownership that they accumulated off chain?
So our idea is that yes, the migration will have a special process. We're still thinking of, let's say, the best way to do this. But for sure, what we want is to guarantee that what have happened in the private chain is guaranteed and has a proof. So if a user, let's say, a migration occurs and one user or one co-owner feels that there's something not right, they have the right to claim, and there's a whole process to this. So yes, the idea is that the same data becomes replicated, and it's almost like a full move to mainnet.
Okay, awesome.
You talk about the value that it's subjective. What's the most common mechanisms that you guys are using to measure this value, and how to distribute these tokens? And if you can share how many organizations, their feedback, if you have a really high bounce rate from those organizations, if they're still active. Also, in how you handle distribution disputes. Is it possible to slash members?
Cool. I hope I got them all. It starts with ownership should be based on contribution, right? Which then throws up the question, what is a contribution, and what is a definition of value? And I think we can all agree here that the way we define value, whether it's GDP or standard Web 2 KPIs or even Web 3 KPIs like TVL, they're really poor proxies for the health of a community or co-ownership or an organization or a country. So I think there's going to need to be this massive shift where we redefine value, how we account for it, how we measure it. But we're not going to wait and see how that plays out. The way we've set up the system is we're going to say, okay, we take existing Web 2 performance management system, whether it's your HR system, your OKR system, your CRM, it doesn't really matter. You have a definition of performance in that, whether it's good or not, we for the moment don't care about. We take that performance data and we connect it to the distribution of reputation tokens. So for now, we work with the existing definition of performance value, whatever it is, that's contextual and sort of based on the user context and customer. And we just use that as a trigger to distribute ownership tokens. And yeah, in the long run, I mean, we'd hope to find a different way to define value, measure value, and account for it so that governance distribution, ownership distribution can be even more equitable. I think that'll take time to play out. Do we slash users? So we wouldn't use that term, I don't think, but because it's a POA, what we can do is we can build in, undo buttons. There's some flexibility around time delays and rollbacks or safeguards that allow you to have another say just before you distribute ownership or just after. Hope that answered it.
Yes, totally. And is it possible to question the mechanism? Like once it's built, can you change it, or is it once and that's it?
So we're big believers in fractals, which means everything should be small groups, small nodes, right? So we think big companies are going to be micro companies. Teams become micro companies with their own token cap tables, and not Nike becomes a DAO, but instead Nike Sales Berlin becomes a small Ownco. And then you have a definition of value that's more easy to manage. It's more easy to govern because it's a small community, it's a small team. So all the problems you get in larger groups now disappear, right? Voter apathy, consensus around definitions of value, measurements of value. In a group of 10, 15, 20 people, it's a lot easier, right? So that's how we think about it. And that's how the system is generally designed on the meta level. And then in the UI, it just expresses as pools. So you can create pools that are groups of people that can share ownership based on certain actions. And that means they're super flexible, to answer your question, right? So you could set up a pool that's temporary. You can set up a pool that's permanent. You can share ownership by connecting to an HR system or an OKR system. And you can change how those tokens are distributed for the pool or while the pool is live. Whether it's a linear distribution where you want to incentivize early contributors, or a linear distribution, it doesn't really matter, or you just want to airdrop inside of that pool. It's really flexible.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hey, I'm curious. We've talked mostly about the supply side, giving out the token, but in terms of what the token actually gives you in terms of rights, specifically on economic rights, is there an on-chain mechanism for doing revenue share, dividend distribution, or even redemption in the case of liquidity event?
Yeah, so how it currently works, what we bridge as real world assets, and we're super bullish on real world assets as a way to give formerly Magic Bean tokens some actual economic value, is RSUs for the US market, restricted stock units. It's just a standard way to share ownership that's proven and tested, and outside of, it's not going to get contested. And then for Europe, we have virtual stock options. And basically, how I said, we look at ownership just essentially as it's just economic benefit, right? Like you said. So whether the proxy is a real share, an equity, or an RSU, we don't really care. The end user doesn't really care. So they just get economic benefits that are attached to these real world asset tokens. And at the moment, that means exit proceeds, any liquidity event you can stipulate in a standard legal agreement that is an RSU or VOOP contract. So liquidity events is the most common one, like exit proceeds, what happens in case of sale of the company, income streams through revenue sharing, or if you just want to top up fiat to the treasury, that's also possible. So those are sort of the economic benefits we can grant through the existing system. We're seeing like new customers now where, I think where we're heading towards is people can just connect their own contracts and tokenize their own assets and use our platform just for the rest of it. But in the end, it'll always be economic benefits. And so far, we've focused on RSU and VSOPs.
Got it. Thanks. And specifically on the case of dividends or revenue share, would that happen for off-chain through Stripe, for example, or would you be passing that through to the addresses in DAI or similar?
Yeah, so I would say it depends on what level of decentralization a company's at and what is the structure. And so Stripe is a very nice example that you mentioned it. And yeah, as a company just begins and using this private chain, which is a locked system, actually, Stripe is one way to utilize this. When we go, as the company goes on chain, of course, there needs to be some other solutions utilizing maybe some form of, it depends, I think at that stage, they would need to pick what form of compensation does this decentralized organization represent. And also, it's not only a technical or a product question, it's also jurisdiction based. So depending on the company's jurisdiction, I think they will have different limitations.
Thanks.
I've got one more question for you. You're using a private chain, proof of authority. Who is running this? Is there one per company? Is there a per company deployment? You use the same for all of them. What is the privacy between these companies, if any? How does this chain work?
Yes, that's a very good question. We are owning this private chain. All companies are in the same private chain, so they have their data. But in order to access this chain, they have to do it through our backend service. And so, yes, there is privacy in the sense that no company could just access other data that they shouldn't access. So it's all controlled from our side.
So it's not really you don't really need a chain for that. You just need a backend.
Yes, that is absolutely the case. You could think of it even as a very slow database on some level. And the idea is like I was saying, so at this stage, it's really not about decentralization. It is not about going forward. It's more about introducing companies as they start to these concepts. And then as they go more and more towards this journey of decentralization, it's easier, it's the same smart contracts that are running in this chain. It will be similar smart contracts that will run on this other chain. And so it makes the whole process more simultaneous. But at the current state, if a company just signs up with an email and password, it's not so different than using a database.
Yeah, totally get it. And then by by getting them used to this type of smart contracts, then when they move to a chain that takes care of the security, and you can take the training wheels off and say like, hey, whatever happens now, nobody has the admin button anymore. You're on your own here. But they have already been trained on how to use everything. Would you say it's a way to mitigate risk?
I would say it's definitely a way to also introduce. It's a way to handhold or reach out to these companies that are very interested but are scared, and so it's a way to mitigate risk, but it's also a way to allow them to test out what this technology means and how. What are the different implications of it? So by the end, yes, they need to be very aware of what are the implications of being fully decentralized.
In a way, focusing on creating the systems and the co-ownership, and less on just look at me, I'm using blockchain, this kind of thing. All right, perfect. With that, I think we've reached the end. And I have to say very, very big thank you to you for coming here, for explaining this. And honestly, I think that your approach of like sort of like dressing it as a blockchain and introducing them slowly to the co-ownership, to the DAO space, but without really using a DAO, this UX, this pragmatic short term, but but committed or maximalist long term definitely works. Well, I mean, it's there to see to work, but I really like this approach. I think a lot of the DAOs are failing because the UX is just absolutely dreadful. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to continue with our all hands. I personally will be following you to see how this evolves.
Yeah, I mean, we're all working on the same thing, right? Sharing ownership and making that mainstream. And I wish everyone here success on that endeavor. And thanks again for the opportunity. Really love it.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Have an excellent one.